17th episode of the Naked Eye podcast. This is Nathan Oxenfeld coming to you today in the middle of the summer of 2017. The purpose of this podcast is to explore natural and holistic approaches to eye care and eye health, and discussing ways to see clearly with just the naked eye, as opposed to depending on glasses or contacts for the rest of your life, or getting impermanent and unsatisfactory surgeries. In previous episodes, I've shared a little bit about my own experience of personally improving my own vision, and I've introduced you to Dr. William Bates, who was the ophthalmologist who pioneered and developed the Bates method, which was the primary practice I employed in my own vision improvement process. And I've interviewed guests, both from the natural vision improvement world, as well as from other alternative therapies. And today's episode will be somewhere in between, because although I'm not interviewing Doug Marsh, I will be reading you his 5-part article titled Alternative Myopia Research and Proven Natural Treatment, which is a beautifully written article that takes stock of our current vision science and not only exposes some of the faults with the current theories about why myopia exists, but he also provides us with a helpful solution by inviting us to explore natural vision improvement. And in the process, he does a wonderful job of explaining a little bit more about who Dr. Bates was and what he accomplished in his lifetime, and how it still persists to this day. If you were to ask any random person on the street why they believe myopia or nearsightedness occurs, there's a strong chance they will either say it's genetic or hereditary, or it comes from too much near work or up close work. Too much reading books, or doing homework, or watching TV, or playing video games, or staring at cell phones. And although those two may be factors at play here, you may be surprised to find out that there is a much bigger cause of myopia developing. And luckily, there's actually something you can do about it. Now, although this article is specific to myopia and nearsightedness, I want you to also think about how these things may apply also to other vision problems, like farsightedness or astigmatism, or double vision, or lazy eye, or any other type of vision complication. And for your reference, I have added links to all 5 sections of this article on the show notes of this episode. And you can find the show notes of this episode, as well as all my previous episodes, at my website, integraleyesight.com/podcast. And you may want to go check out the actual article itself, because it contains a couple pictures and diagrams and graphs that are mentioned in the article and talking about some of the data. But the reason I wanted to read it out loud to you was so that you could rest your eyes while you obtain this information. So ideally, you can either close your eyes, or even better, palm your eyes while you listen. And palming is one of the more popular practices, relaxation techniques from the Bates method, where you simply cover your eyes with your cupped palms without touching your eyes or putting any pressure on your eyes, just blocking out 100% of the light and allowing your elbows to rest on a surface or on your knees so your arms don't get tired, or you can even lie down on your back and palm in that position. But whether your eyes are closed or you're actually palming your eyes, you can allow images and visions to appear in your mind as you listen to my voice. And it turns out that practicing visualizing and imagining and picturing things with your eyes closed can actually be a powerful way to work on your eyesight and your insight. So this full article is found on the Inner Blindness website, or eyeblindness.org, which is a splendid resource that you should probably head over and check out. It's a great blog run by David and a couple other natural vision educators who contribute articles and posts. So I've added a link to that website as well, so you can check out all the different blog posts, check out all the different topics that are being discussed over there in the forum. There's several free ebooks that you can read and check out on their website, including this article you're about to hear. Now, my first exposure to Doug Marsh wasn't this article that recently came out. It was actually when I read his book called Restoring Your Eyesight, a Taoist Approach, in which he explains natural vision improvement and the Bates method through the lens of Taoism. And if you're not familiar with Taoism, it's an Eastern religion that centers around this concept of finding out ways to live in harmony with the Tao, which literally translates to the way. Back in college, I actually minored in religion studies, with a particular focus in Eastern religions. And I remember that studying Taoism was my absolute favorite, because it's very much based off of the writings of Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching, which is a book full of paradoxes. So later, when I found out about the Bates method and then came across Doug Marsh's book, I got really excited that he had combined two of my favorite things, the Bates method and Taoism. And as I was reading through the book, I really realized that this book was much different than any other book I had ever read about the Bates method or natural vision improvement, because he beautifully relates some of the concepts from the Bates method to some of the philosophies of Taoism. So I really encourage you to check out his book, Restoring Your Eyesight, a Taoist Approach, if you're interested in not only continuing to get more ideas and applicable practices and techniques to actually take better care of your eyes and work on improving your vision, but also learning a little bit about Taoism and diving into some more of the deeper philosophical concepts found within the book. And in some of my recent correspondences with Doug about getting permission to read you this article, he shared another recent article he put forth called the Dao of Colors. So once again, he uses this unique gift he has to correlate some of the Taoism philosophies with concepts of light and color and darkness. So I've added a link to that article in the show notes as well for you to head over and read that if you're interested. So without further ado, I'm going to begin reading you Doug Marsh's 5-part article called Alternative Myopia Research and Proven Natural Treatment, going through all 5 sections: the introduction, problems with the excess near work theory, problems with the hereditary theory, a radical mind-body theory for the cause of myopia, and finishing with a successful and empowering solution to control myopia. So I hope you learned a lot from this powerful article, and that it helps you continue to get closer and closer to your vision goals of achieving happy, healthy eyes and clear, perfect vision, naturally, with just the naked eye. Alternative Myopia Research and Proven Natural Treatment. Section 1. Introduction. As discussed in the article in my previous posts, titled Orthodox Myopia Research, Blind Alleys and No Cure, eyeglasses prescribed for myopia during the 19th century were considered to be injurious to youth, because their eyes were still growing. Some eye doctors back then would never prescribe eyeglasses to children. Others, in some circumstances, may have prescribed weaker lenses than the full correction, under the condition that the eyeglasses were to only be used for seeing distant objects and never to be used for near work. Imagine, then, how those eye doctors, if they were around today, would react to the current frenetic pace of 24/7 and information overload. Nowhere to be seen would there be ornate handwriting done by quill, pen, and ink. Instead, people would be observed continually fixated on computer screens and smartphones, oblivious to their surroundings while emailing or texting. No doubt, the 19th century visitors would first be struck by future shock at such sights in our highly technological and digital era. They would be further stunned and dismayed to see so many people wearing eyeglasses, surely thinking, quote, "After all these years, why hasn't the cause for myopia been discovered yet? And why are so many children and some toddlers being forced to wear eyeglasses all day long?" End quote. Spanning over 2 centuries, myopia research has seen a few twists and turns along the way, but essentially, the massive volume work by countless specialists has come full circle. The prevailing 19th century theory was, quote, that short sight itself cannot be looked upon as hereditary, but only the tendency to short sight, end quote. The affliction was considered to somehow be a combination of genetics and environmental factors, especially excess near work in school. Fast forward to today, where the theory is, quote, a melding of genetics and environment into a richly detailed combination of both nature and nurture, end quote. No matter how rich the myopia theory is considered to be, it's impoverished from the standpoint of finding a cause. Without a definitive cause, the orthodoxy can offer no cure. The work of an independent eye doctor emerged in the early 20th century that challenged the bogged-down status quo. William Bates, a practicing American ophthalmologist, believed that neither heredity or excessive near work were factors behind the onset of myopia. He wholeheartedly agreed with the 19th century contention that eyeglasses, simply a palliative, were an ineffective and damaging long-term treatment method. His radical new theory of myopia being an acquired condition meant that it could be managed and reversed naturally without resorting to optical poison. Bates was an accomplished eye surgeon, performing operations as needed for patients with serious eye diseases and ailments. He also treated run-of-the-mill problems of blurred vision, including myopia. He had prescribed eyeglasses as the conventional treatment for many years until he realized they were not helping his patients, and were probably worsening the condition. He was determined to find a better way, and did so after years of extensive research. Since he wasn't tied to any specific dogma or others' agendas, he could be truly independent in his work. Most of his research papers, written over many years, were published in the New York Medical Journal. Bates was also well read on historical myopia research and the endless debates that continued about the topic. Having studied the scientific literature, both from his era and that from the 19th century, he was well aware of the theoretical difficulties and controversies. Quote, no phase of ophthalmology has been the subject of so much investigation and discussion as the cause and prevention of myopia. Voluminous statistics were collected regarding its occurrence, and are still being collected. The subject has produced libraries of literature, but very little light is to be gained from the perusal of this material, and for the most part it leaves the reader with an impression of hopeless confusion. End quote. Most of the confusion lay in the 2 myopia theories, excess near work or heredity. There were anomalies and observations that didn't fit neatly into either side of the argument. Section 2. Problems with the excess near work theory. As stated in Section 1, the 19th century consensus view held that children perhaps had a hereditary disposition to myopia, but the affliction ultimately manifested with the demands of too much close work in the classroom. The experts reasoned that pre-industrialized indigenous people were hunter-gatherers, or agrarian societies, whose survival relied upon keen eyesight for primarily distant viewing. The theory suggested that, with industrialization and compulsory education, somehow the eyes weren't able to adapt to such a dramatic cultural shift. Visual blur, in the form of myopia, thus ensued as a defect in children so predisposed. The problem with this argument, as Bates noted, was the experts generally forgot, or conveniently ignored, quote, the fact that primitive woman was a seamstress, an embroiderer, a weaver, an artist in all sorts of fine and beautiful work. Yet, women living under primitive conditions have just as good eyesight as men, unquote. At the 1904 World Fair in St. Louis, Bates tested the eyes of a few indigenous people from various countries and found their vision to be normal. His observations and assertions were validated decades later by other researchers, whose findings extended from 1937 through 2005. The researchers tested the vision of indigenous cultures in Africa, Alaska, and South America, and found almost no myopia present. Quote, less than 1% out of a total of over 5,000 eyes tested, unquote. As will be discussed in Section 3, once the native Alaskan people became westernized with compulsory education, myopia developed as a problem. The rigors of near work in the classroom haven't always invoked myopia in students. There are recorded cases by researchers in more recent years that showed myopia incidence rates in some schools that were almost as non-existent as traditional Aboriginal cultures. On the flip side of this issue, Bates pointed out that it was common knowledge among his colleagues during his era that adults who were illiterate or didn't partake in near-work activities sometimes developed myopia. Such observations were made in later studies of illiterate groups in 1962 and 1993, where researchers determined incidence rates in the range usually found in school children. Bates also noted that myopia isn't just an affliction in humans. He humorously stated, quote, I have examined many domestic and menagerie animals, and have found them in many cases myopic, although they neither read, nor write, nor sew, nor set type, end quote. The major blow to the near-work theory occurred in the late 19th century. As discussed in my earlier article, Orthodox Myopia Research, Blind Alleys and No Cure, numerous ergonomic and environmental measures were undertaken at many schools to help mitigate the circumstances thought to cause near-work stress and myopia. Unfortunately, those attempts to control the onset and progression of myopia ultimately failed. The tide then turned, as this led experts to conclude that heredity was the primary factor behind myopia. Section 3. Problems with the hereditary theory. A 1913 edition of an Encyclopedia of Education noted that recent studies of that period amply demonstrated that myopia was an inherited condition. The encyclopedia cited and recommended the research work of Carl Pearson as one of the authorities on the matter. Pearson was the English mathematician who is renowned for establishing the modern discipline of statistics and the correlation coefficient that bears his name. Pearson's cited research work was a co-authored report that relied on secondary vision science statistics for hereditary relationships. The trouble was, the previously documented data were scant and of questionable value in many respects. The report fully admitted this difficulty and stressed that their work was simply a first study into the relationship between genetics and myopia. Nevertheless, Pearson and his co-author forged ahead and attempted to show a good correlation between genetics and myopia, glossing over the actual weak correlation. That's because their main agenda was eugenics. Although the report had the veneer of highly respectable and objective science, it was a deplorable piece of overt eugenics propaganda. It included some very disturbing comments, such as, quote, stable stock, end quote, for children with normal vision, and, quote, unstable stock, end quote, for children with myopia, a condition that, quote, frequently makes the child backward, end quote. The concluding section in Pearson's report included far more outrageous and bizarre statements. quote, defective physique including defective powers of sensation are, we know, closely correlated with defective mentality. They are both signs of an ultimate physical degeneracy. The first thing is good stock, and the second thing is good stock, and the third thing is good stock. And when you have paid attention to these three things, fit environment will keep your material in good condition. No environmental or educational grindstone is of service, unless the tool to be ground is of genuine steel, of tough race and tempered stock. To bring home this fact in each department of human physique and mentality seems to be the urgent social problem of today." End quote. The Education Encyclopedia made absolutely no mention of such vile eugenics bias, and felt that the report demonstrated the futility of myopia prevention measures. As a result, the encyclopedia recommended that school children should have their eyes, quote, tested by competent oculists fitted with suitable concave lenses, the error of refraction fully corrected, end quote. This is a sordid episode in the history of vision science, particularly when you realize the long-term implications of the paradigm shift. It appears that such tainted advice set the stage for the palliative treatment method, or optical poison, that persists to this day, prescribing full-strength eyeglasses for young myopes as early as possible. Dark history aside, Bates studied the scientific literature and found that, by 1920, no satisfactory evidence had come forth from researchers which demonstrated genetics as a primary cause of myopia. Bates observed previous statistics that provided a clear argument against the genetic theory. In 1882, 250 North American Aboriginal students attending a government school in Pennsylvania had their eyesight tested and documented. 10% had either incipient myopia or had developed myopia after attending school for 2.5 years. Regarding the findings of this study, Bates commented that, quote, primitive peoples who have always had good eyesight become myopic just as quickly as any others when subjected to the conditions of civilized life, end quote. Once again, Bates was well ahead of the game, for it took another 49 years until other researchers came to these same conclusions. A now famous and frequently cited study in vision science, led by Francis Young, a psychology professor and myopia researcher, found a high incidence of myopia among young Alaskan Eskimos who had received westernized compulsory education. The elder Eskimos, who had been raised in a traditional lifestyle and hadn't had such acculturation, were virtually free of nearsightedness. Genetics could not have caused such a dramatic and sudden shift in visual acuity. In 1996, the American Vision Institute, of which Young was a member, provided further evidence that the genetic theory was, quote, bankrupt. U.S. government statistics showed a steady nationwide myopia incidence rate of 15% from about the 1920s to 1950. The rate suddenly rose to 40% by 1980. Hereditary factors could not have possibly accounted for the surge in the prevalence of myopia in such a short time span. Although Bates rejected the two opposing theories of excess nearwork and heredity, he didn't eliminate the role of nurture. He discovered that myopia was, indeed, an acquired condition, but for reasons previously never considered in vision science. Section 4. A radical mind-body theory for the cause of myopia. The broad advances made in the natural sciences during the 19th century inspired those in vision science that similar progress was possible within their discipline. Beaming with such confidence, a prominent ophthalmologist of that era stated that his profession had, quote, furnished means more and more exact for the determination of the visual acuity and for the measurement and correction of its defects." End quote. Studying a rock in geology or light through a prism is one thing. Studying the eye simply as a refractive object in the skull of a live human subject is quite another. Taking dead matter to the extreme, there was even a study conducted in 1903 that helped bolster the genetic theory for myopia based on measurements and analyses of eye sockets in cadavers. The Cartesian mind-body schism and reductionism were thus very much the order of the day at that stage. Unfortunately, reducing the eye to an object, cut off from the mind and the rest of the body, remains the current orthodox vision model. For example, artists' depictions of disembodied normal and myopic eyeballs are commonplace, comparing one to the other. The normal eyeball, we're told, is primarily spherical in shape, whereas the myopic eyeball is elongated into somewhat of an egg shape. This out-of-round shape is responsible for myopic blur, as images converge in front of the retina, the inside back of the eye, instead of directly on the retina for normal vision. However, bear in mind that the oblong shape depicted is highly exaggerated simply for the comparison and explanation. In reality, the greater axial length is quite meager for myopia, as, quote, an increase of only half a millimeter, approximately 1/64 of an inch, apparently reduces acuity from 20/20 to 2200 or worse, end quote. The status quo view contends that the elongated eyeball shape is permanent and irreversible. Such a pessimistic notion of myopia didn't jibe with Bates's years of clinical experience. He eventually began to have serious doubts about what he'd been taught at medical school concerning nearsightedness. Year after year, he had observed numerous cases where the degree of myopia seemed to instantaneously fluctuate, briefly while being measured. The number of cases he observed weren't simply isolated anomalies. Visual acuity for distance focusing seemed to be active and flexible, not passive and static, as the orthodoxy maintained. The facts troubled him greatly, and he simply couldn't just ignore them, for he stated, quote, "It seemed to me that if a statement or theory is a truth, it must always be a truth. There can be no exceptions. If errors of refraction, myopia, and other blurry eyesight conditions are incurable, they should not recover or change their form spontaneously," end quote. Bates was determined to find answers to the facts he faced, which conflicted with textbook doctrine. He embarked on a series of experiments over a period of 6 years, studying the eyes of various animals, as well as analyzing vision in humans. He concluded that visual acuity was largely in the mind of the beholder. By introducing the mind into the equation, he essentially reunited the false object-subject dichotomy. His radical new theory can be summarized as follows. 1. Myopia does not occur due to an organic change in the shape of the eyeball, but is a functional affliction caused by tension of several eye muscles. 2. Myopia is caused by a mental strain to see objects clearly at a distance, not at the near point as was previously suspected. 3. Mental strain in the form of negative emotions is the underlying cause of the muscular tension. So now these are my words, not from the article, just to summarize those in my own words. This is just talking about myopia, but I believe this applies to almost all vision problems. So, according to Dr. Bates, vision problems are not purely a product of heredity or near work, but rather the mental strain to see objects clearly. If you have myopia, if you're nearsighted, the blur in the distance is coming from the mental strain to try and see objects clearly in the distance, not from too much near work. If you are farsighted, then the blur you experience up close is coming from the mental strain to try and see objects clearly up close. And it is that mental strain in the form of negative emotions or traumatic experiences or fear that is the initial root cause of the muscular tension in several eye muscles that is contributing to the refractive error or the vision problem. So back to the article. When spontaneous changes in acuity temporarily sharpen one's focus, they are referred to as flashes of near-perfect vision. In the introduction of my book, I described the first spontaneous flash I had experienced early in my natural vision improvement process. I had several more flashes from time to time before I had discovered Bates's explanation of this phenomenon. Optometrist Antonia Orfield, in a 1994 journal article, described them as, quote, momentary fluctuations of clarity, end quote. She was speaking from first-hand experience, as she perceived these fluctuations during the process of completely reversing her own myopia. Some of Orfield's other observations were very similar to Bates's rejection of the orthodox teachings of myopia. She stated, quote, the optical bench model distracts us. It makes us think that distance vision is a passive process of light falling on the fovea, or the small central area in the retina with the most light receptors. It isn't. As I learned during my training, vision is a motor act, and if patients realize this, they are empowered to work on their vision. I never tell them they have long eyeballs. That is so fatalistic, so permanent, so mechanical, and so often wrong. End quote. Orfield's training was in behavioral optometry, obtained only through postgraduate extension programs, not part of a regular curricula of optometric colleges. Arthur Skeffington founded behavioral optometry, a holistic approach to vision, in the mid-20th century. It was an amalgamation of concepts he had developed from studying and meeting with, quote, leaders in psychology, neurology, education, and other disciplines, end quote, including the likes of Hans Selye, Arnold Gesell, and Wilder Penfield. His maxims of vision is motor and vision is learned encapsulated eyesight as a dynamic mind-body process which is molded by the environment, potentially impeded and impaired by negative influences. Skeffington started his optometric practice in 1917 and began sowing the seeds for behavioral optometry during the next couple of decades. It's highly probable that he would have known about Bates's book, published in 1920, and his regular monthly magazine, Better Eyesight, published from 1919 to 1930. Perhaps such material influenced Skeffington's thinking early on. Pure speculation on my part. If that was the case, incorporating and acknowledging some of Bates's ideas would certainly have been too damaging for Skeffington's endeavor, given Bates's negative reputation by the establishment. Even so, behavioral optometry is derided and ridiculed to this day by the old guard paradigm police and their banal propaganda tactics. In any event, Bates's theory also applied to conditions such as astigmatism, where the front portion of the eye tends to have a non-symmetrical, warped curvature. Bates himself had the ability to produce, at will, a change of 1.5 diopters. He also noted the case of a surgeon at the Manhattan Eye and Ear Hospital who was similarly able to produce even greater astigmatism, as witnessed by hospital staff and other eye doctors. Because myopia was determined to be a functional disorder, Bates was confident its progression could be halted and reversed. He eagerly went to work teaching numerous children and adults how to improve their visual acuity naturally. Section 5. A successful and empowering solution to control myopia. Part 1. Reversing and improving myopia in school children. Documented success. Reversing and improving myopia by natural means is more of an art than a science, since the strain to see is highly subjective. Bates devised a number of principles and techniques to help guide individuals to relax the mental strain that was responsible for the optical strain. Consequently, he cautioned that results would be variable. Quote, "The ways in which people strain to see are infinite, and the methods used to relieve the strain must be almost equally varied. Whatever the method that brings most relief, however, the end is always the same, namely, eye muscle relaxation." End quote. The time frame for improvement is also variable, depending on the degree of myopia. Children with low myopia could invariably improve the quickest if they were under 12 years of age and had never worn glasses. In most such cases, Bates found that the children could return their eyesight to normal within a year or less. For adults who've worn glasses for a number of years and have higher degrees of myopia, it will take a considerably longer time period, such as the 7 years in Orfield's case. She warned her patients embarking on myopia reversal that it would be a long and slow process to achieve normal acuity, as she did. Bates's experiences with children improving their nearsightedness were based on successes he achieved in various schools. When he was practicing his profession in Grand Forks, North Dakota, he initiated a myopia prevention program in 1903 at the request of the superintendent of schools. The program continued with positive results for another 8 years. The myopia rate was fairly low to begin with, only 6% of 1,500 students, but went down to almost nothing, less than 1% of 2,000 students in the year 1910. Bates commented on what he'd learned from this program. Quote, "It is impossible to see anything perfectly when the mind is under a strain. And if children become able to relax when looking at familiar objects, they become able, sometimes in an incredibly brief space of time, to maintain their relaxation when looking at unfamiliar objects." End quote. When Bates had moved back to New York, he started a similar myopia reduction program in 5 public schools, with a participation of 5,700 students. Only students not prescribed glasses were involved in the program. They were taught to practice reading a familiar Snellen eye chart silently at their desks each day. The goal was to learn to prevent straining so as to better see objects at the distance. Ordinarily, the children would strain to see unfamiliar objects, such as writing or figures on the blackboard, maps, diagrams, or pictures. Such strain would induce a myopic change in their acuity, and over time, low levels of myopia would gradually settle in, rather than stabilizing back to normal acuity once the strain to see was gone. The teachers were taught how to test and record the vision of the children at different intervals throughout the school year, using a Snellen eye chart from a distance of 20 feet. An unfamiliar chart was used for each test, not the one on which the students had practiced daily. so that the students would not have memorized the letters. As well, schools would request an objective medical examiner from the health department to occasionally test the students and verify the recorded results. A considerable reduction in myopia occurred, with the percentage of students with myopia dropping from 58% to 36%, and the percentage of students with normal 20/20 visual acuity increased from 42% to 58%. The successes of both the Grand Forks and New York programs were documented in the New York Medical Journal. Bates documented other successful case studies too numerous to mention in this article. His natural methods for relieving eye strain were successful for improving other conditions, such as astigmatism and presbyopia, or old age sight. As well, he recommended eye movement re-education instead of surgery to treat people with strabismus, or misalignment of the eyes. The remarkable photos below are one such case. The girl was a patient of another ophthalmologist who was planning surgery and consulted Bates for his opinion of which particular muscles to operate on. Instead of surgery, Bates recommended eye re-education, which he initiated and instructed. The other ophthalmologist continued the treatment and successfully corrected the girl's strabismus in that manner within a month. Part 2. Natural Vision Improvement, an Empowering Alternative. Quote, "The fear that there will one day be established a despotism based on science is a ridiculous and absurd fantasy." End quote. So claimed a social theorist who, in 1819, foresaw a trust towards scientific leaders totally different than towards the previous theological leaders. Over 2 centuries of trust in vision scientists has led us to the sorry state we face today, a worldwide myopia epidemic that continues to escalate each year. The current intellectual leaders in vision wring their hands, confused and helpless, over the cause and cure of myopia. Cast adrift with recycled and worn theories, they can do no more than offer the trite recommendation, quote, "More research is needed," end quote. More research down the same dead ends is the ridiculous and absurd fantasy. The greater absurdity and tragedy is that the myopia boom is largely an iatrogenic outcome of a large-scale prescribing of concave lenses as the standard treatment. The endless struggles in myopia research to find answers and a solution are indicative of the inherent difficulty within the scientific method itself. Reductionist, mechanical science, as applied to the material world, has its limitations when studying the human being. Such specialist science, parceling out multitudes of individual body parts, which supposedly have clearly defined boundaries, is utterly lost when it comes to the holistic nature of vision and the integration of the senses and psyche. Natural vision improvement, the proven alternative which embraces holism, offers a method to control and reverse myopia for those so inclined. My next article, titled "Optometrist Cures Her Own Myopia," discusses more about Orfield's success story in relationship to some natural vision improvement fundamentals. Her high-profile case is simply one of many success stories since Bates' time. See the post titled "Bates Method Success Stories" for further details. Critics can condemn and ridicule Bates and natural vision improvement to their heart's content, backed only by their delusional scientism and hubris, but they can't argue with such successes. Even a supposedly progressive eye doctor, called a neurodevelopmental optometrist, doesn't believe myopia improvement is possible. His research has included the role of stress in the onset of myopia, yet he flat out states that it is incurable. Quote, "Can myopia be reversed? Unfortunately, no." End quote. Obviously, he hasn't seen any successful cases. But to end with a quote from William Horatio Bates, commenting in 1921 about rigid Orthodox views, he said, quote, "It does not seem to me that a doctor is justified in telling a patient that he is incurable just because he has never seen such a case cured. This may cause the patient to accept as inevitable a condition which might have been cured, and may even prevent nature, because of the depressing effects of discouragement, from doing what the doctor has failed to do." End quote. Doug Marsh is a retired civil engineer who improved his vision and wrote Restoring Your Eyesight, a Taoist Approach, a book about blending the Bates method with the ancient principles of Taoism. You can find all 5 sections of his April 2017 article called Alternative Myopia Research and Proven Natural Treatment on the Inner Blindness website, eyeblindness.org, or you can find links to all 5 parts of the article in the show notes of this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe, rate, review, and share with your friends and family, and I'll talk to you next time.